Ah yes, Freedom Wars. The seemingly last bastion of the PlayStation Vita is finally moving onwards from Sony's retired handheld. With the help of Bandai Namco, developer Dimps, partially made up of members of the original development team, is bringing the Monster Hunter-style action RPG to modern platforms. It became a hit as a Vita exclusive in 2014 for its unique persistent world mechanics and dystopian sci-fi premise that made it more than just something that played off of its influences. And I can tell you firsthand that there's a certain excitement to Freedom Wars Remastered since it's as true to the original release as you could possibly imagine. I had the chance to get roughly 4 hours of hands-on time with a preview build of Freedom Wars Remastered on PlayStation 5. After spending about an hour with a tutorial to shake off a decade of rust, I jumped back into high-level operations. In the following 3 hours, I cleared several instanced missions, hunting massive monster-like machines and rescuing civilians. And unwittingly tacking on extra years to my sentence by acting a fool back in the prison, aka Panopticon, that you call home. If you're not familiar with Freedom Wars, or need a refresher since it's been quite some time, it takes place in a dystopia set in the far future where the surviving population fights over limited resources. People are either wardens running the Panopticon, or prisoners, aka sinners, stuck in indentured servitude and forced to fight for a, quote, greater good. You play as a sinner, and by taking on operations and contributing resources to your Panopticon, you shave years off of your 1 million year prison sentence. Aside from sending yourself to instance hunts, there is a story that develops as you get deeper into operations and learn more about your fellow sinners on your prison block, and you get caught up in some good old anime-style drama. You're also under constant surveillance by your android companion who applies disciplinary action, and you earn little bits of freedom as you clear more missions. Something worth noting here is that the remaster features expanded voice acting and an English dub. That includes the androids, which has been done pretty oddly. Android characters are voiced through a primitive text-to-speech style modulator that clearly mispronounces words.
Greetings, sinner.
It's said to be intentional to add to the creepy dystopian vibe, but it comes off as rather tacky. Overall, it's a dark premise for sure, but it's goofy and satirical in a way that has only gotten more and more bleak as time has gone on. The story remains intact in the remaster, exactly as it was in the 2014 release, and that faithfulness extends to the gameplay mechanics, for better and worse. Aside from the control scheme being updated to make more sense for modern gamepads, the gameplay is pretty much one-to-one as I remember it. Lock-on targeting, third-person shooting, melee combos, the thorn system, all of that is unchanged. So if you thought it was janky back then, you'll definitely find it janky now. Don't come in expecting it to be streamlined or revamped to feel like a new release. However, there is a novelty to the way Freedom Wars experimented with unique mechanics and brought it all together in a fully fledged action RPG on Vita. While every character has a melee weapon for basic light and heavy attack combos and a firearm to take shots from a distance, it's the thorns that made Freedom Wars stand out. Thorns are akin to hook shots or Spider-Man's webs. You can attach these to enemies and slam them on the ground, or zip right onto them to get in melee range. It's also the key to traversal, letting you reach high up places or quickly dart around the battlefield to stay nimble. Considering it feels a little sticky to use since it remains unchanged, it still works really well as an intuitive gameplay mechanic and a premier feature that made Freedom Wars a ton of fun to begin with. There's still a thrill to whipping around your thorn to help take down a beastly machine, but it serves other functions as a means for utility on the battlefield, like setting up traps or throwing out area of effect heals for your party. It's not terribly complex, but there's a beauty in the simplicity, and I still got a kick out of it while playing this remaster. Because this is a faithful remaster, I found the structure of operations, the instance missions that mainly drive the gameplay loop, to be somewhat repetitive. Even at Code 4 operations, which are several hours deep into the story, many of the maps and enemy types are reused. Different missions pop up to add variety, such as hostage rescues, wave-based encounters, or straight-up battles of attrition against hulking damaged sponges that'll take 10 to 15 minutes to conquer. However, it tends to fall into routine after long sessions. Not that it absolves it of any shortcomings that were apparent back in 2014, but the repetition was better suited as a handheld game played in shorter bursts. Freedom Wars doesn't necessarily evolve drastically as it goes on, but you're still upgrading weapons with materials you gather and earning new ones from mission to mission. There's a decent amount of weapon types to mess around with before settling on what works for you. The one quality of life change worth noting here is that weapon crafting and upgrades are streamlined to take the old randomized aspects out of the process. This aligns with crafting systems seen in modern games, and this was a deliberate decision according to the dev team. The biggest idea behind Freedom Wars was the persistent world aspect of panopticons. Players would join their own panopticons based on region, and the missions they take on would all contribute to its status, and you would be ranked against rival panopticons in perpetuity, as if it was this ongoing multiplayer competition without having to do direct PvP. That remains intact with the remaster. Traditional multiplayer and co-op was a major part of the original Freedom Wars 2, and it's also being preserved. Although I didn't get to try it out for the preview, the developer said that matchmaking has been revamped to reflect that of modern games, which should be a vast improvement over the original system. Part of me sees Freedom Wars Remastered more as a novelty. It's fundamentally the 2014 game with some quality of life necessities. It was a perfect fit for Sony's old handheld, and a blast to sink hours into, competing with other panopticons across your region and reducing your prison sentence in futility. I'm not sure if it's going to hit the same way it did 10 years ago, but I do believe this is a big win for preservation and making a cult classic much more accessible in a faithful form. Freedom Wars was pretty experimental for its time, and it tried new ideas that are great to see holding up relatively well. Even just constantly adding years to your sentence for minor infractions as you roam around your prison block was annoying, but it's a good goof that fed into the game's overall themes. Novelty or not, the developer stated that remastering the original game is the necessary first step in hopes of revitalizing the series. In conversations during the preview, they told me that they were able to come to an agreement with Sony regarding the license and partner up with Bandai Namco for this re-release. They'd been looking for opportunities to release something related to Freedom Wars, maybe a sequel. However, they said it was very difficult to set up a team, but once they did, they decided to start by remastering the original game. Their hopes are for this to do well enough so they can take the next steps for looking into a potential sequel. And while they don't know if that's even possible yet, they have a ton of ideas they'd want to put into it. After playing it, it's pretty wild to see a Vita game remastered with many of its assets true to what they look like in original form. On PlayStation 5, Freedom Wars Remastered runs at 4K resolution and 60 frames per second, which is really nice, although it does create a sort of uncanny valley effect with character models, animations, and environments that haven't gotten a makeover. I also played a little bit of the Nintendo Switch version in handheld mode, and although it's considerably lower resolution and only ran at 30 frames per second, it's still very much playable, although it's disappointing to see a former Vita game struggle on Switch. While it's definitely not a technical marvel by any measure, everything that made the original a Vita classic either remains intact or has been touched up to mitigate frustrations that were present back in the day. You'll be able to start serving and working time off of your 1 million year sentence when Freedom Wars Remastered launches on January 10th, 2025 for PlayStation 4 and 5, PC through Steam, and Nintendo Switch. For more on Freedom Wars Remastered, you can check out my full written preview on IGN.com with interview quotes from the developers, or peep the Freedom Wars Remastered reveal trailer. And for everything else in the world of gaming, stick with IGN.